Among history's most remarkable figures, two women stand whose strength and legacy still echo across centuries: Archduchess Maria Leopoldina of Austria and Christina of Denmark. Each carved her legacy across continents, navigating politics, tragedy, and power in a world ruled by men. Let us begin with the first, Archduchess Maria Leopoldina of Austria, who was born on the 22nd of January in the year 1797 at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Austria. What led this quiet and scholarly princess to the heart of Brazil's greatest revolution? How did a woman trained in science and virtue come to shape a nation's independence? And what inner strength helped her navigate betrayal, exile, and heartbreak in a foreign land far from home? Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. Maria Leopoldina's story begins at the heart of the vast Habsburg Empire, where she was born into one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. Her father, Emperor Francis II, ruled over the Holy Roman Empire during one of its most turbulent periods, and her mother, Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily, belonged to the royal house of Bourbon. Though she was the third surviving child of her parents, Maria Leopoldina was quickly recognized for her curious mind and deep sense of moral duty. From early childhood, her life was shaped by war and upheaval. Europe was in the grip of revolutionary forces, and Napoleon's rise to power would soon topple the ancient monarchies. Still, her upbringing inside the imperial court in Vienna was guided by values of compassion, order, and intellect. Her grandfather, Leopold II, had laid down an educational philosophy for his descendants to raise children who would serve the people with humility and purpose. Maria Leopoldina embraced these ideals wholeheartedly. She excelled in sciences like botany and mineralogy, mastered 7 languages, and was fascinated by the mysteries of nature. Her stepmother, Empress Maria Ludovica of Austria-Est, became a guiding force in her life, introducing her to poets, philosophers, and composers, and encouraging her to think beyond the limitations of court life. These early lessons would shape her destiny in ways no one at the time could have imagined. But destiny had other plans. As political tides shifted, her family began seeking alliances that would preserve Austria's influence. It was through one such alliance that Maria Leopoldina was promised to Dom Pedro, the heir of the Portuguese crown, and a prince now residing in Brazil. At just 20 years old, she would leave everything she knew behind to become a bride in a distant, tropical land, one that was still struggling to define its own identity. And so, the journey of an Austrian archduchess toward becoming the Empress of Brazil had quietly begun. Maria Leopoldina's childhood unfolded against a backdrop of revolution and renewal. While Vienna's grand palaces glittered with tradition, the world outside was transforming. Monarchies were falling, liberal ideas were spreading, and armies marched across borders. The young archduchess, though sheltered behind palace walls, was never far from the tremors shaking Europe's foundations. After the death of her mother in the year 1807, Maria Leopoldina was just 10 years old when her father married again, this time to Maria Ludovica of Austria-Est, a cultured and deeply intellectual woman who became more than just a stepmother. She became a mentor and spiritual guide. Under her care, Leopoldina's education took on a rare richness, not limited to the usual royal accomplishments. From literature and music to history, science, and international politics, her studies were both rigorous and inspiring. She learned classical languages like Latin and Greek alongside modern ones such as French, Italian, and Portuguese. Her lessons included arithmetic, geometry, drawing, piano, and horseback riding, but it was the natural sciences that truly captivated her. Botany, geology, and mineralogy ignited in her a quiet but profound passion for the world's wonders. Her interest in nature led her to begin collecting minerals, coins, seashells, and pressed flowers. These were not just hobbies. They were the pursuits of a mind trained to observe, analyze, and document. Her father encouraged this curiosity, and Maria Leopoldina became something rare in her time, a royal woman with a scientific mind and an instinct for diplomacy. She was also frequently exposed to cultural experiences beyond textbooks. She visited museums, botanical gardens, factories, and theaters. She learned to speak in public, to debate, and to understand how societies functioned. It was a preparation not just for marriage, but for leadership. Amid these studies, she was acutely aware of the fragile political order around her. Napoleon Bonaparte had taken Europe by storm, and her own family had been reshaped by these events. One of her elder sisters, Marie Louise, had been married off to Napoleon himself, a match that scandalized many in their dynasty. Her maternal grandmother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, once said bitterly, "Now I am the devil's grandmother," in reference to this uneasy alliance. These moments left their mark. Maria Leopoldina grew up with a sense of duty sharpened by uncertainty. She was not simply being raised to wear a crown, she was being trained to survive a world in flux. And in time, this preparation would serve her in extraordinary ways, far from the classrooms and ballrooms of Vienna. In the Europe of kings and empires, marriage was never just about love. It was about alliances, power, and survival. For Maria Leopoldina, this reality became personal in the autumn of the year 1816, when word arrived from her father she was to marry Dom Pedro, the Prince Royal of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. The match was not made by affection, but by politics. Emperor Francis I of Austria saw in this union a chance to strengthen ties with the Portuguese monarchy, which had relocated its court to Brazil after Napoleon's invasions. On the other side, the Portuguese royal family hoped the prestige of a Habsburg bride would reinforce their claims in the New World and reduce British influence in their territories. Maria Leopoldina was just 19. She had never met her husband-to-be, and the descriptions she received were vague and overly flattering. Still, she accepted her fate with the calm resolve of someone raised for duty. Her uncle, Prince Metternich, remarked simply, "It is her turn to marry." The official contract was signed in Vienna on the 29th of November in the year 1816. Yet Leopoldina did not leave quietly or unprepared. Over the next few months, she immersed herself in maps, history books, and Portuguese language lessons. She read extensively about Brazil's geography, flora, and people. What began as an obligation soon became a mission. She started to see Brazil not merely as a destination, but as her future. On the 13th of May, in the year 1817, a marriage by proxy was held in Vienna. Maria Leopoldina stood before the altar while her uncle, Archduke Charles, represented Dom Pedro. In the crowd, artists and dignitaries watched a Habsburg princess vow herself to a country she had never seen, and to a man she had never met. But there was more than ceremony behind the scenes. The Austrian court, recognizing Maria Leopoldina's interest in the sciences, arranged for a unique entourage to accompany her to Brazil. Alongside noble attendants and court officials were botanists, zoologists, mineralogists, painters, and even a taxidermist. This would become known as the Austrian Scientific Mission, an expedition unlike any other, driven by her own curiosity and vision. Her marriage, then, was more than a royal contract. It was a bridge between two continents, two cultures, and two destinies. And for Maria Leopoldina, it was the beginning of a personal transformation that would take her far from the safety of Vienna's courts and deep into the heart of a new empire. In the summer of 1817, Maria Leopoldina's voyage to Brazil began not with fanfare but with patience and preparation. She departed Vienna on the 2nd of June, traveled to Florence, and waited weeks for instructions from the Portuguese court. The political uncertainty in Brazil, stirred by recent revolts, made timing delicate. Finally, on the 15th of August, she boarded the ship from Livorno. Her convoy included two major vessels, D. João VI and São Sebastião, carrying her extensive trousseau, gifts for the royal family, and personal collections of minerals, coins, and books. Her entourage was grand and unprecedented: Austrian scientists, artists, guards, ladies-in-waiting, and even a chamber orchestra. The voyage across the Atlantic lasted 86 long days. The ships were burdened with cargo and knowledge. Botanists and naturalists were there to document Brazil's wonders, inspired by the works of Alexander von Humboldt. Maria Leopoldina herself spent her time reading maps and studying the flora and fauna she would soon encounter. She was not a passive passenger. She was a woman preparing to meet her destiny with eyes wide open. Her first step on Portuguese soil was not in Brazil, but on the island of Madeira on the 11th of September. It was a brief but symbolic pause before the final stretch. On the 5th of November, she arrived in Rio de Janeiro. The city awaited her with anticipation, unaware that this quiet and thoughtful archduchess would soon change the course of its history, not just as a foreign bride, but as a scientific mind and political force with a heart devoted to Brazil. On the 5th of November in the year 1817, Maria Leopoldina finally arrived in Rio de Janeiro. She had traveled thousands of miles with scientific hopes and diplomatic expectations. But what she encountered was not the grandeur of empire. It was discomfort, unfamiliarity, and profound cultural shock. Instead of the polished royal court she had envisioned, she found a city marked by heat, insects, and chaos. The royal residence, the Palace of São Cristóvão, was modest and poorly maintained. Muddy courtyards, decaying furniture, and damp, insect-infested rooms made her first impressions harsh. The opulent gowns and velvet robes she had brought with her began to rot in the tropical humidity. Even court ceremonies lacked the elegance she was accustomed to. More surprising still was her new husband. Dom Pedro, just 18, was impulsive and ill-mannered. He spoke little French, her strongest court language, and his Portuguese was coarse. Far from the refined gentleman described in court letters, he had a history of love affairs, and was, at the time of their meeting, involved with a French dancer who had to be quietly removed from court. Maria Leopoldina, however, did not allow disillusionment to overcome her sense of purpose. Despite her quiet disappointment, she began to adapt. She formed connections with local artists, including Jean-Baptiste Debret, and focused on establishing her household with discipline and dignity. Though her new world was not what she expected, Maria Leopoldina was not easily broken. She had not come to Brazil as a passive bride, but as a thinking, determined woman with a role to play, and she was just getting started. In the early months of her new life, Maria Leopoldina stood at a difficult crossroads between the ceremonial expectations of a royal wife and her deeper calling as a thinker and leader. The distance between her inner world and her external reality grew starker with each passing day. Dom Pedro, despite brief moments of affection, remained erratic and emotionally distant. His temper flared often, and his personal interests revolved more around horse races and flirtations than politics or intellectual conversation. While Maria Leopoldina longed for thoughtful companionship and shared ideals, her husband often seemed uninterested in her ideas, her books, or even her presence. In contrast, she continued to build a purposeful life rooted in learning and quiet influence. She surrounded herself with artists, scientists, and thinkers. She worked closely with painters like Jean-Baptiste Debret and supported the work of naturalists, even encouraging the foundation of Brazil's first natural history museum. These were not simply diversions. They were expressions of her belief that knowledge and culture could elevate a society. Behind palace walls, she lived a double life, the obedient consort in public and the passionate learner in private. She continued writing letters to her family in Austria, describing the challenges she faced, but rarely showing despair. In those letters, she wrote of her mission in Brazil, not just as a political bride, but as a mother of a nation in the making. The cultural divide between her and Dom Pedro would only widen in years to come. But Maria Leopoldina remained steady in her vision. If her marriage had fallen short of promise, her mission had only just begun. By the early 1820s, Brazil was no longer just a distant colony. It was a land trembling with possibility, unrest, and transformation. Political tensions between Portugal and Brazil had reached a boiling point. The Portuguese courts, emboldened by liberal movements in Europe, demanded the return of the royal family and sought to reduce Brazil's status once more to that of a subjugated colony. Maria Leopoldina, raised in the heart of absolutist Europe, had been trained to serve monarchies, but now found herself questioning their hold. As she observed the Brazilian people, she saw not rebellion, but a longing for dignity, unity, and sovereignty. Her sympathy began to shift. She began to write letters to European confidants, making clear distinctions between the Portuguese and the Brazilians, between empire and emerging identity. In these pivotal moments, she formed a powerful alliance with José Bonifacio de Andrada, a Brazilian intellectual and statesman. Together, they envisioned a future where Brazil could break free peacefully, constitutionally, and honorably. Maria Leopoldina's education and instinct gave her a sharp understanding of international politics. She knew the world was changing, and she wanted Brazil to stand among the nations. Her husband, Dom Pedro, remained hesitant. Pressured by Portugal and uncertain about his path, he even pleaded to return home. But Maria Leopoldina stood firm. In her letters, she wrote plainly, Brazil must be preserved. Leaving now would destroy everything. Only your presence, your energy, and your resolve can save Brazil, she warned him. It was a turning point not just for Brazil, but for Maria Leopoldina herself. She was no longer just the empress. She was becoming the conscience of a nation, the woman who saw independence before anyone else dared to speak its name. As Brazil moved closer to the edge of revolution, one voice behind palace doors was guiding its future, quietly, yet with determination. Maria Leopoldina, though never seated on a battlefield or podium, became the hidden architect of Brazilian independence. Her strategy unfolded through letters, conversations, and unwavering resolve. By mid-1822, Dom Pedro faced mounting pressure from both Lisbon and internal factions. The Portuguese courts demanded his return, threatening to dismantle the unity of Brazil by dividing it into separate provinces. At this fragile moment, Maria Leopoldina was left in Rio de Janeiro as Princess Regent while her husband traveled to São Paulo. Her leadership was swift and bold. On the 2nd of September, she convened the Council of State, examined new decrees from Lisbon, and realizing the danger, signed the formal recommendation that Brazil should declare independence. She sent this message, along with letters from José Bonifacio and other advisors, directly to Dom Pedro. But her most powerful appeal came in her own words. "The fruit is ripe. Pick it now, or it will rot." Her message was clear, emotional, and firm. Within days, Dom Pedro stood by the Ipiranga River and shouted, "Independence or death," a moment now engraved in Brazilian history. While the prince claimed the public glory, the empress had already laid the groundwork. She had held the court together, advised her husband, defied the courts, and chosen Brazil over her native Austria. Maria Leopoldina did not fight with weapons, she fought with vision. In a world where women were rarely seen in political roles, she proved that influence does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears silence, courage, and a mind sharper than steel. In the late summer of 1822, Brazil stood on the brink of nationhood, and at its helm, for a brief but decisive moment, stood a woman. As Dom Pedro traveled through Sao Paulo to rally political support, Maria Leopoldina was left behind in Rio de Janeiro, not merely as a consort, but as official regent of Brazil. A formal document dated the 13th of August declared her acting head of state, granting her full authority to make critical decisions. And she did, calmly, intelligently, and with full command of the Council of State. She was not simply a placeholder. She governed. When Lisbon's latest demands arrived, orders that would have shattered Brazil's territorial unity, Maria Leopoldina knew hesitation would cost the nation its future. Guided by her ally José Bonifacio, she analyzed the legal risks, read diplomatic correspondence, and ultimately signed the decree advising Dom Pedro to declare Brazil's independence. Her regency was not only an act of authority, it was an act of faith. Faith in Brazil, in unity, and in the belief that liberty could exist within monarchy. In a letter to her husband, she emphasized that the nation could not wait. Pick the fruit now before it rots. Though history would later spotlight Dom Pedro's cry by the Ipiranga River, it was Maria Leopoldina's mind and pen that had cleared the path. She took on the weight of command at a time when women were rarely allowed even a voice in politics. And in doing so, she became the first woman to govern an independent American nation, not through inheritance, not through accident, but through preparation, conviction, and the courage to act when it mattered most. As Brazil celebrated its newfound independence, Maria Leopoldina's personal world quietly collapsed. While she had won the admiration of the people, she was losing the affection of the one person whose loyalty mattered most, her husband. Dom Pedro, now Emperor of Brazil, had fallen deeply into an affair with Domitila de Castro, the Marchioness of Santos. The betrayal was not hidden. The Marchioness was brought into the palace, appointed as lady-in-waiting to the Empress, and even accompanied the imperial couple on official trips. It was a public humiliation, and the Empress, once seen as a mother of the nation, now found herself sidelined in her own home. Worse still, Dom Pedro legitimized his daughter with Domitila, granting the child a noble title and the honorific dona, acts that wounded Maria Leopoldina both as a woman and as a mother. She confided in her sister, Marie Louise, calling Domitila the seductive monster who had destroyed her peace. Emotionally isolated, the Empress sought refuge in her children, in correspondence with Europe, and in her faith. Yet even that sanctuary was fading. In November of 1826, her health began to decline rapidly. Pregnant once more, and already weakened by grief and stress, she suffered from cramps, vomiting, and hallucinations. Rumors swirled that an argument between the Emperor and Empress had turned violent, with some claiming he physically assaulted her during a fit of rage. Whether or not those tales were true, the emotional toll was undeniable. Maria Leopoldina, once so full of hope and purpose, was now trapped in a gilded palace, betrayed, exhausted, and alone. The woman who helped forge a nation was quietly fading from its spotlight, even as her legacy grew stronger in the hearts of its people. By December of 1826, Maria Leopoldina's frail body could no longer bear the weight of sorrow, pregnancy, and isolation. Just 29 years old and expecting her 8th child, she was plagued by relentless cramps, fever, and bleeding. Her attendants noted her pale complexion, erratic speech, and haunted eyes. The Empress, once the pillar of Brazil's political stability, was now confined to her bed in silent suffering. Doctors were summoned, clergy prayed, yet nothing eased her decline. Rumors of a violent altercation with Dom Pedro, whether real or exaggerated, only deepened public anxiety. The people of Rio de Janeiro, who once celebrated her arrival with fireworks, now gathered in churchyards and palace gates, weeping and whispering prayers. Her popularity had never wavered. If anything, it had intensified. In her final days, Maria Leopoldina was surrounded not by royal fanfare, but by spiritual devotion. Churches held processions. Even in the pouring rain, the statue of Our Lady of Glory was carried from its temple, an act never before seen, toward the palace, as if the heavens themselves were pleading for her life. The city, rich and poor alike, mourned as one. On the 11th of December in the year 1826, Empress Maria Leopoldina passed away. The official cause was reported as complications of pregnancy, perhaps puerperal fever, but her death carried the mark of profound emotional and physical exhaustion. The grief was nationwide. Bells tolled, shops closed, newspapers printed bulletins of despair. Foreign ambassadors wrote home, stunned by the unity of public sorrow. Brazil had not only lost its empress, it had lost the woman who had believed in its future when few others dared. In life, she was a stranger in a foreign land. In death, she became its most beloved daughter. Maria Leopoldina of Austria arrived in Brazil as a political bride, but she left behind the legacy of a founder, a visionary, and a mother of a nation. Though her reign as empress lasted barely 4 years, the impact of her presence would shape Brazil for generations to come. She was not remembered merely as the consort of Dom Pedro. She was remembered as the voice that urged independence when her husband hesitated, as the mind that governed when the monarchy trembled, as the heart that chose Brazil over bloodlines and duty over despair. She brought with her to Brazil a devotion to science and learning. Her passion for natural history helped establish Brazil's first museum and inspired a generation of European scientists to study the country's vast landscapes. Through her influence, knowledge was planted like seeds, quiet, persistent, and transformative. She also left behind a new national identity. It was Maria Leopoldina who envisioned the green and yellow of Brazil's flag, blending the House of Braganza with the House of Habsburg. That banner still flies, silent testimony to her presence. Her legacy is also one of sacrifice. She gave up her homeland, endured humiliation, and died far from her family, all in the service of a future she would never see. But the people saw, and they remembered. To this day, she rests in Sao Paulo's monument to independence, not as a foreigner, but as a founding figure. A woman who crossed oceans, endured betrayal, and quietly helped a nation find its voice. Let us now turn to another remarkable woman of royal descent, Christina of Denmark. Was born in the year 1521 in Nyborg Castle, Denmark. What happens when a child is born into royal chaos, yet grows into a duchess who defied emperors, rejected kings, and ruled on her own terms? What secret strength allowed Christina to survive betrayal, war, and politics at the heart of Europe? Was she a mere pawn of dynasties, or the quiet player who outwitted them? Christina's birth came at a turning point in Northern Europe. Her father, King Christian II of Denmark was deeply controversial, a ruler known as much for reform as for repression. Her mother, Isabella of Austria, belonged to the mighty Habsburg dynasty and was the sister of the future Emperor Charles V. This made Christina a rare child of two powerful but competing worlds. However, her peaceful infancy was short-lived. When Christina was barely 3 years old, her father lost his throne in a bloody rebellion. Forced into exile, her family fled from Denmark to the Low Countries. There, under the watchful eye of her Habsburg relatives, Christina's unusual and politically charged childhood began, one that would shape her into a woman few could ignore. After fleeing Denmark, Christina's parents sought refuge in the Burgundian Netherlands, but tragedy would soon fracture her young world. In the year 1526, her mother Isabella died of illness at just 24 years old. Christina was only 5. The loss left a deep void, not only in her personal life, but in the fragile balance of dynastic power that surrounded her. Her father, King Christian II, had fallen from grace across Europe. Branded a tyrant by his enemies and kept under constant surveillance, he soon became a political liability even to his Habsburg in-laws. With her mother gone and her father disgraced, Christina and her siblings were taken from his custody. They were handed over to their powerful aunt, Margaret of Austria, a woman who ruled the Netherlands on behalf of the Habsburg Empire and had no children of her own. Margaret's court in Mechelen was not just a home for royal orphans. It was a finishing school for future monarchs. Here, Christina was raised alongside other children of statecraft and nobility, taught to read, write, speak multiple languages, and understand the art of diplomacy. Her education was sharp and disciplined, but always carried the undercurrent of political ambition. Christina learned early that her future would not be her own to decide. In this gilded world of mourning and maneuvering, a clear message emerged. She might be a child, but she was also a prize, one whose marriage could shift the balance of power across the continent. As Christina grew into her teenage years, Europe stood on a knife's edge, split between old rivalries, religious turmoil, and dynastic ambition. Christina, now a polished and observant young woman, was more than a royal orphan. She was the niece of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. This alone made her a strategic jewel. When Margaret of Austria passed away in the year 1530, Christina came under the guardianship of another formidable woman, Mary of Hungary, her aunt, and a seasoned ruler. Mary governed the Netherlands with resolve and quickly recognized Christina's diplomatic potential. At a time when alliances were forged not by treaties, but by marriages, Christina's future would be decided by court whispers and political calculation. In the mid-1530s, Charles V made a bold move. He offered Christina in marriage to Francesco Sforza, the Duke of Milan. This was no romantic match, it was a power play. Milan was a prized territory contested by France and the Habsburgs. By installing Christina there, Charles could tighten his grip on northern Italy, but the offer came with tension. Milan had long been a thorn in France's side, and Christina, though Habsburg by blood, would now live surrounded by enemies of her empire. In her early teens, she was thrust into one of the most politically charged environments in Europe. The Duchess-to-be was watched by foreign eyes, whispered about by courtiers, and weighed down by the legacy of two empires colliding, all before she had even taken her vows. Christina of Denmark entered Milan in the year 1533 as the new Duchess, barely 12 years old and already a pawn in Europe's vast political chessboard. Her husband, Duke Francesco Sforza, was more than 2 decades older, a ruler caught between the ambitions of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Their union had been orchestrated by Emperor Charles V to reinforce Habsburg dominance in Italy. Despite the grandeur of her new court, Christina's role was deeply restricted. She was expected to be loyal, quiet, and symbolic, the elegant face of imperial power. The marriage, though celebrated in public, was cold and functional in private. Christina's presence in Milan served more as a diplomatic shield than a personal chapter in love or domesticity. What she did gain, however, was exposure. Surrounded by advisors, envoys, and foreign emissaries, Christina observed how men negotiated treaties and manipulated alliances. She watched her husband struggle to maintain authority in a city boiling with tension. Through it all, she remained composed, adapting, listening, learning. Just 2 years into their marriage, Francesco died under suspicious circumstances. Christina, now just 14, was left a widow but also a free duchess. For the first time, she held power in her own name, and with that power came new suitors, new threats, and a new chapter of European matchmaking. The political game of marriage had only just begun, and Christina, young but sharp, was already becoming a player rather than a piece. After the sudden death of her husband in 1535, Christina of Denmark became a widow at just 14. Though she mourned publicly, her position quietly elevated. She was now a duchess without a consort, beautiful, Habsburg-born, and politically unclaimed. It was a combination that caught the attention of every major European court. With her lineage, charm, and newfound independence, Christina was considered one of the most desirable royal brides of her era. But distance and politics posed problems. Not every suitor could travel to see her, nor could she visit distant lands. So, Emperor Charles V commissioned a bold solution, a portrait. The famed artist Hans Holbein the Younger, celebrated for his lifelike precision, was sent to capture Christina's likeness. In the winter of 1538, Holbein painted her in Brussels. The result was stunning, a poised, somber young woman dressed in black, eyes steady, features refined. There was no smile, only composure and quiet strength. This portrait was not merely art, it was a political weapon. Copies of it were sent to courts across Europe, sparking offers and proposals. One particularly notorious suitor was King Henry VIII of England, who had already disposed of 2 wives and sought another queen. Christina's response to this proposal would become legendary. Though young, she knew her value and understood the dangers of aligning with unstable power. Through paint and diplomacy, Christina declared her presence across the continent, not with words, but with a face that spoke volumes. When King Henry VIII of England received Christina's portrait in 1538, he was captivated. Her image, painted by Hans Holbein, had reached his court as part of a campaign to find his next queen. Henry, then in his late 40s, had already divorced 1 wife, executed another, and separated the English Church from Rome. Christina, barely 16, was considered a perfect blend of youth, nobility, and alliance value. But Christina was not impressed. Her advisors understood the risks of placing her in England, where queens were discarded or beheaded based on the king's moods. Behind palace walls, she is said to have made a remark that echoed through history. If I had 2 heads, I would gladly place one at the disposal of the King of England. It was a bold refusal, rare for a woman of her rank. Though the quote may have been embellished over time, the sentiment was clear. Christina would not allow herself to become another casualty of Henry's political and personal upheaval. Her decision earned her quiet admiration in European courts, especially from those who feared Henry's growing unpredictability. Henry was disappointed but moved on. Christina, meanwhile, had reinforced her reputation as clever and self-possessed, a woman who could think for herself, even in a world ruled by men. In refusing the English crown, she protected her life and her legacy, proving once again that she was far more than a pawn in someone else's game. Christina's brief widowhood had made her the focus of European diplomacy, but the courtly intrigue did not stop with Henry VIII's rejection. Her uncle, Emperor Charles V, still viewed her as a key political asset. Though she had once been married to Francesco Sforza, the former Duke of Milan, his death had left a power vacuum. The emperor was determined to reassert control over this prized territory, and once again, Christina would be his instrument. In 1541, Charles arranged for Christina to marry Francis, Duke of Lorraine, a nobleman with close Habsburg ties. While not as volatile a match as England might have been, it was still political to the core. The marriage aimed to strengthen Habsburg influence along France's eastern border, where the Duchy of Lorraine stood as a strategic buffer. Christina, now in her early 20s, approached this second marriage with grace but caution. Francis was younger than her first husband and more gentle in demeanor, but power still hovered between them. She was not just his consort. She was a woman who had ruled, negotiated, and rejected kings. As she settled into the court at Nancy, Christina's role shifted from one of symbolic alliance to genuine governance. Her life became entwined with the complex politics of a region squeezed between imperial ambitions and French hostility. Though the marriage was more stable, it was not free from pressure. Once again, Christina stood at the crossroads of dynasties, but this time with more experience and far more influence. Tragedy struck again in 1545, when Christina's second husband, Francis, Duke of Lorraine, died unexpectedly at the age of 27. Once more, Christina found herself a widow, but this time her position was vastly different. Now in her mid-20s and mother to 3 young children, including the heir to Lorraine, she was no longer a pawn of empire. She was the Duchess Dowager and Regent. Francis's death triggered political unrest. The Duchy of Lorraine, perched between France and the Holy Roman Empire, was too valuable to be left unchecked. Christina acted swiftly. She assumed regency on behalf of her young son, Charles, and began to manage state affairs with a calm authority that surprised many. Her years of observation, diplomacy, and survival had prepared her for this exact moment. Christina focused on preserving her son's inheritance and maintaining neutrality in an increasingly hostile region. She strengthened ties with the Habsburgs while cautiously avoiding direct confrontation with France. Her regency was marked by firm decisions, shrewd alliances, and the quiet assertion of a woman who had watched empires rise and fall from the inside. Yet her power was always under scrutiny. As a foreign-born woman in a male-dominated court, Christina faced resistance from local nobles and imperial advisors alike. Still, she held her ground. For the second time in her life, widowhood had not diminished her, it had made her stronger. Christina of Denmark was no longer a royal bride or grieving duchess. She was now a ruler in her own right. Christina's regency in Lorraine was never meant to last forever, but neither was it allowed to end on her terms. In the late 1540s, tensions between France and the Holy Roman Empire reached a boiling point. Lorraine, caught between the two powers, became a diplomatic pressure point. Under mounting French influence and subtle threats, Christina was urged to step aside from the regency. In 1552, her young son Charles was declared of age, despite being just 13. It was a political move designed to curtail Christina's authority and reduce Habsburg influence. Reluctantly, Christina surrendered her position and left Nancy. But exile did not mean irrelevance. Settling first in Brussels and later in various Habsburg courts, Christina remained closely involved in Lorraine's affairs. Through letters, emissaries, and family ties, she continued to advise her son and monitor European events. Her intelligence network was subtle but wide-reaching, and many still consulted her on diplomatic matters. She took on the unofficial title of Governess of Lorraine, a role that combined maternal guardianship with political stewardship. Though physically distant from her duchy, her guidance shaped her son's early rule. Even in exile, Christina retained influence, not by force, but through memory, reputation, and careful maneuvering. Her life was no longer marked by thrones or ceremonies, but by letters, counsel, and strategic patience. In exile, Christina proved that leadership does not always require a crown. Sometimes, it only requires the will to shape the future from the shadows. As Christina of Denmark moved through the courts of Europe in the 1550s and beyond, her presence became both symbol and strategy. No longer bound by a specific title or territory, she floated between imperial courts in Brussels, Vienna, and occasionally even Rome, where diplomacy played out not on battlefields, but behind velvet curtains. And Christina, with decades of courtly training, had become a master of subtle influence. One of her most complex challenges emerged from her proximity to papal politics. As a Habsburg by birth and a regent by experience, she often found herself navigating tensions between the Catholic Church and imperial rulers. The popes of her era, especially Paul IV, were suspicious of Habsburg ambition and wary of women with too much political voice. Christina, though outwardly devout, represented both. At one point, her involvement in negotiations related to her son's position and marriage alliances brought her into indirect conflict with Rome. Papal advisors objected to her influence, suggesting she was overstepping the acceptable bounds of a dowager duchess. Christina remained unfazed. She practiced cold diplomacy, composed, deliberate, never emotional. Whether writing carefully crafted letters or dispatching discreet envoys, she spoke in the language of power without threats. Her diplomatic posture impressed many, even those who disliked her presence. Though denied official titles in her later years, Christina remained relevant, even feared. She was no longer just the duchess of a distant province. She was a seasoned operator at the highest levels of European diplomacy, quietly countering the papal court with wit, lineage, and sheer endurance. As Christina aged, her political presence did not fade, it merely transformed. Though she no longer held official power in Lorraine, she remained deeply involved in securing the future of her children and the wider Habsburg-Lorraine line. For Christina, dynasty was not just family, it was duty, and she would do whatever was necessary to ensure its survival. In the 1560s, her son Charles faced increasing pressure as Duke of Lorraine. France loomed large, threatening the autonomy of his duchy, while the Habsburgs expected loyalty and alignment. Christina quietly positioned herself as his advisor from afar, steering him toward choices that would preserve Lorraine's independence without alienating powerful neighbors. Marriage alliances became her main battlefield. Christina arranged noble matches for her daughters and monitored the potential unions of her nieces and nephews. She was careful, calculating, and always looking several steps ahead. Her understanding of how bloodlines shaped power had only deepened since her own youthful days as a bride of diplomacy. She was also keenly aware of how religious tensions could unravel dynasties. With Protestantism spreading and wars flaring across Europe, Christina advised caution, tolerance, and smart alliances. She discouraged rash decisions and encouraged long-term vision, a rare quality in turbulent times. Even from a distance, Christina defended her family's interests like a strategist guarding a fortress. Her letters, envoys, and quiet influence helped safeguard the dynasty she had served since childhood. In a world of shifting loyalties, she remained the constant thread, weaving her family's legacy with patience, foresight, and unmatched resolve. By the late 1560s, Europe was fracturing under the weight of religious wars, territorial ambitions, and generational rivalries. Christina of Denmark, once a young bride at the mercy of emperors and kings, now stood as a seasoned observer and occasional player in this chaotic landscape. The world she had known was unraveling, and the alliances she once relied on were no longer reliable. The Catholic-Protestant divide tore through the Holy Roman Empire, engulfing courts, duchies, and families. In France, the wars of religion raged. In the Netherlands, rebellions surged against Spanish rule. Even within the Habsburg circles, internal divisions and regional conflicts intensified. Christina, with her vast experience and diplomatic instinct, recognized the danger of choosing sides too quickly or too publicly. Her own family, scattered across courts and causes, mirrored the wider European fracture. Some supported the Catholic League, others leaned toward tolerance or reform. Christina's instinct was to preserve unity, even if it meant walking a delicate line. She maintained contact with both Protestant and Catholic nobles, using her name and reputation to calm tensions where she could. But the weight of division was heavy. Christina's influence, once formidable, now faced limits. Age, geography, and shifting power made it harder to act decisively. Still, she remained a voice of reason, urging caution while others rushed to arms. In an era defined by broken treaties and religious violence, Christina of Denmark held fast to the idea that diplomacy could still matter, even as the world around her fell deeper into chaos. In her final decades, Christina of Denmark settled permanently in Brussels, far from the courts and duchies where she had once held influence. The bustling Flemish capital, though politically complex, offered her stability and a familiar Habsburg environment. There, in the heart of the Spanish Netherlands, she found space to reflect, though she never withdrew fully from the world of politics. Even in her 60s and 70s, Christina remained a vigilant matriarch. She kept detailed correspondence with her children, monitored developments in Lorraine, and stayed informed about the struggles facing her extended Habsburg family. The wars across Europe pained her, not only because of their violence, but because they threatened the very dynastic vision she had spent her life defending. In Brussels, she surrounded herself with scholars, courtiers, and loyal confidantes. Her household became known for its refinement and order. Visitors described her as dignified and reserved, with sharp eyes that revealed a mind still deeply engaged. She patronized churches and charities quietly, preferring influence behind the scenes rather than public spectacle. Though her name no longer dominated headlines, Christina had not faded from memory. Ambassadors continued to visit her for advice, and her signature still carried weight in diplomatic letters. She remained, until the end, a symbol of resilience, a royal woman who had endured war, widowhood, exile, and betrayal, yet never relinquished her belief in the enduring power of lineage, wisdom, and patient statecraft. Brussels became not a place of retirement, but a final stage from which Christina watched the slow, painful evolution of the Europe she had once helped shape. Christina of Denmark passed away in Brussels on the 10th of December in the year 1590, at the age of 73. Her death marked the end of a turbulent yet extraordinary life, one that had begun in royal privilege and moved through courts, marriages, regencies, and political exile. She was buried at the convent of St. Clair in Brussels, though her final resting place has since become a point of historical debate. News of her death was met with quiet mourning in diplomatic circles. In Lorraine, her son Charles honored her legacy, recognizing how much of his duchy's independence had depended on her vigilance. In Habsburg courts, her name was spoken with respect, though not always with affection, Christina's strong will and independent path had often made her difficult to control, but controversy followed her even after death. Some Catholic clerics criticized her political maneuvers, accusing her of excessive ambition or meddling. Others viewed her tolerance and correspondence with Protestants as dangerous. Meanwhile, certain Protestant historians, writing in later centuries, portrayed her as a symbol of restraint and diplomacy in an age of fanaticism. Her life defied easy categorization. Was she a loyal Habsburg, a reluctant duchess, or a shrewd strategist? Perhaps she was all three. What is certain is that Christina left behind more than letters and lineage. She left a legacy of calculated defiance, of dignity amid compromise, and of a royal woman who played the long game even when the odds were stacked against her. In death, as in life, Christina of Denmark remained a figure who demanded recognition, not simply remembrance. Christina of Denmark's legacy is one of choice, deliberate, strategic, and often bold in a world that offered royal women few paths of their own. From the time she was a teenage widow resisting the hand of Henry VIII, Christina made it clear that she would not be used as a pawn without protest. Unlike many noblewomen of her age, she was not merely handed from one court to another. She negotiated, delayed, and at times outright refused. Her defiance did not stem from rebellion, but from clarity of purpose. Christina understood the weight of dynastic politics and the delicate role women played within them. She accepted her place within the Habsburg machinery, but on her own terms. Whether navigating the intrigues of Milan, the Regency of Lorraine, or the halls of Brussels, she did so with quiet strength and remarkable foresight. More than a duchess or regent, Christina emerged as a stateswoman. She forged diplomatic ties, protected her son's rule, and advised monarchs with the wisdom of lived experience. Her life, unfolding over the course of 7 tumultuous decades, spanned the rise and fall of empires, the fracture of Christendom, and the transformation of royal power. What makes Christina remarkable is not only what she endured, but what she shaped. In an age when queens were expected to serve and yield, she strategized and governed. While history often favors the loudest rulers, Christina's story is one of measured influence, of a woman who did not inherit thrones but made her presence felt in every room of power she entered. She was, in every sense, a duchess who chose, and in choosing, carved out a legacy all her own. What do you think about Archduchess Maria Leopoldina of Austria? Was Maria Leopoldina a brave visionary who quietly shaped the future of Brazil through diplomacy, science, and personal sacrifice? Or was she a lonely royal, caught between two empires, crushed by duty and betrayal, remembered more for her silence than her strength? And what about Christina of Denmark? Was Christina a master of survival who refused to become a pawn in the dynastic chessboard of Europe? Or a reluctant duchess, molded by exile and circumstance, who held power only to protect others, yet paid the price of solitude and sacrifice? We would love to hear your thoughts. Were these women symbols of resilience or silent victims of royal history? Did their strength truly echo through time, or did history simply forget their struggles while celebrating louder voices? History often hides its quietest heroes, but their choices shape the world in ways still felt today. Stay tuned for more untold stories from royal courts, forgotten exiles, and women who changed history from behind the scenes. Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past, stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.